Hello, and welcome to another edition of Artist Response to a Moment. My name is Joy Davis. I am the manager of adult and community program here at the Walters Art Museum. Today, I am here with illustrator Erin Fostel. Hi, Erin.
Hi.
And before we hop in, I just want to encourage those viewing us today to ask questions, and we will do our best to make sure we are answering said questions as we move towards the end of the program. I just wanted to start by pulling up an exquisite example of Erin's work. Beautiful. And what is the name of this piece?
This piece is called The Weight of Absence. It was the first piece I did in my Baltimore series, which is a series of drawings I did to handle the grief of my father's death. He was an architect, and he taught me how to sort of observe and appreciate the architectural surroundings around me. And so after he passed, I wanted to do a series to commemorate him. And this was the first piece that I did.
That's beautiful. And I know that we are also kind of sitting in a very specific moment right now, and we are in the middle of a pandemic still, and we're in the midst of a revolution. So how are you working right now? How are you navigating this time?
Sporadically. I think sometimes I can actually focus on doing some work, but sometimes I am definitely glued to the internet, glued to social media. I'm on Twitter, just like trying to keep up with everything that's happening. And it can just feel very overwhelming with all of the things just keep, packing on. So I find myself working very sporadically right now.
And I think that's okay. And I think that's great that you shared that, because I think that there's some guilt around that, not being productive enough. And so I really appreciate you speaking to that. And so, in the events of the last 3 months or so, how has it affected your process of actually creating once you sit down and you start to draw?
Well, the main thing has been because I work from photographs, I haven't necessarily had the ability to go get new reference photos. Since I'm supposed to stay home, I'm not supposed to be out and about. And before the quarantine started, I was working on a women's bedroom series. And this meant that I was going into women's homes. And that was not something I could really do during the quarantine. So I've had to either look back through all of the photos that I had previously taken and try to, make some work from that, or just patiently waiting until, it's safe enough to go and get some more stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that all artists kind of navigate those spaces a little bit differently, and their process a little bit differently. And so I just wanted to shift gears a little bit to talk about the architectural elements of over at the Walters, what you're drawn to at the Walters Art Museum. You, in preparing for this, you kind of give a really great example that I'm going to pull up here for us to see.
Yeah, this stairwell, I just have a lot of memories of it as a child. It's like a dark, windy stairwell, and I used to love running up it every time we would go to the Walters. So it's kind of the first thing I think of when I think of being in the Walters. Um, but the Walters is, it's comprised of what, like three buildings, and I feel like the vibe of the building is just filled with contrasts. Like there's a lot of dark, intimate spaces like this stairwell, or even like some of the library rooms that are in like the Hackerman house. And then there's like bright open spaces, a lot like the other big staircase that, you think of in the Hackerman house, which is just, this big, beautiful, open, intricate, very light filled space. And so when I move through, the Walters, I'm very aware that like I'm going in and out of spaces that feel both like a little intimate and dark, and like open and bright. And I think that it creates a really interesting vibe on viewing the art that's in those spaces.
That's a really great way to kind of describe just the many different contrasts that happen within the museum as well. Because there's just so many, and light and dark just moving between these two images, you can kind of see this contrast and kind of see the newness and the ancient and the old and how they mix together. And I'm curious about how you think of your work as we're looking at these stairs. How do you think of your work as accessible? Do you think of it as accessible? If so, why?
Yeah, I actually, I think my work is really accessible, and I really love that about it. I think a lot of really representational work is just inherently more accessible to a viewership. Um, but I think, in particular, the Baltimore series really struck a chord with a lot of viewers, especially in Baltimore, because a lot of the buildings that I was drawing were buildings that like other people had noticed or had some sort of physical or emotional connection to. And so I think when I was working on that series, I was really speaking to a lot of people and how they feel as they move around the city and what they love. So I think it was like an extra level of accessibility for people.
And I'm curious for you, because your work is seen as a traditional medium, but I feel that your work actually, the way you transform the medium, you turn it into more of a contemporary medium. And I'm just curious, how do you do that? Is it in your working style? Is it in how you evolved as an artist? Just tell us more about that process.
I don't know. I was thinking about this question a lot over the past few days, and I remember being in school at MICA and being really worried about making work that felt really academic.
Mm,
In my mind, academic means, you know, representational but very stiff. Like you're showing what something looks like, but you're not really maybe giving any kind of feeling with how it looks. You're not, you know, and I think maybe the reason my work feels a little, hopefully a little less academic and a little more contemporary or has some emotion to it, because I'm not a stickler. Like my stuff looks representational, and it has been, like, if you're viewing it on a screen like this, it can be viewed as like photographic, but it's really not. Like there's some wonky stuff happening in there. I pick and choose like what I render, and I think that that really leaves the drawing open. And I think that it makes it breathe a lot more. And I think that breathing room is what makes it feel a little bit more alive. And that's probably what makes it feel a little bit more contemporary, something that's like happening like now instead of, you know, like 100 years ago.
good point. And you mentioned that your work can kind of pass off as photographic, or people have spoken about your work in that way. And I'm curious, does photography influence your work in any way?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think I know that there's a lot of accounts that I follow on Instagram who I wish I'd made a note of before this, but I'm really drawn to photography as probably my primary source of inspiration, especially black and white photography. But when I was in school at MICA learning about, you know, art history, I was very, very taken with the photographs of Bernd and Hilla Becher, who did all of the like the photographs of like the old industrial areas with like the water towers. Um,
Oh, mhm.
and I also really love the surrealist photography of Florence Henry. And these are two artists that I've just always been looking at over the past few years. And one of them is more sort of in like a lighter grayscale, like the Becher photographs are very much kind of in like a medium tonal area. But then Florence Henry has a very wide contrast in her work. And so it just keeps me thinking about tonal values. And I just love tonal values. So I like looking at them.
I love that you can kind of hone in that your work is about, in some cases, about tonal value, and that's what you pick up on when you're looking at other work, whether that's for inspiration or just, for the beauty and the aesthetics of that artwork. And
Yeah.
in thinking about that and what you get from artwork, but also what folks get out of your artwork, I think that a lot of people, including myself, have an emotional connection to your work and the subjects of your drawings, which may seem peculiar to some because they're buildings, they're static, they seem like static objects. But I'm curious if that was an intentional process for you throughout all of your artwork, and or if it was unconscious. you did mention earlier that the impetus for starting the Baltimore project came from a very emotional place. But as you move through your art practice, do you feel like that's an intentional choice?
Yes. Yeah. I think, I'm drawing things that feel intimate, whether I'm making, the drawings of Baltimore are public spaces, but for me, the drawings themselves are very intimate, because I did really view them as, vessels for this grief that I was working through. Um, and then the bedroom series that I had been working on after this series, that's a very, very special, intimate space. Like that is a space that only one woman occupies. It's like her sanctuary, and so I really wanted to be as I really wanted to represent it as truthfully as I could, but also really try to put in there or imbue in the drawing how I felt being in that space. And I don't know necessarily how I do that. It's probably just through the intention of how I draw because I'm drawing with such attention. I'm really laboring over all of the aspects and all of the objects that are in front of me. And I think just through that act of doing something that is, very focused and very intentional, that can just come off, that you can just feel that intention and you can just feel that desire to really show you something that's important. And so I think that can just be a really inherent thing that viewers just take in, and they may not even necessarily recognize it if they don't have a personal connection themselves. Hopefully, they feel some kind of personal connection is there or sense that it's there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how you move between subject, I guess is the best way to describe it, even though there's multiple subjects and objects happening in the frame of your work, and how something like a building and something like a home, whether an external facade of a building and a home can have the same sort of emotional value for both you, but also for the audience viewing it. And I'm really curious about your process. And this is a question I don't think I've ever asked you. What is your process for selection? How do you choose? I think that you do tend to, what I've seen from your work, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, you choose subjects based on like a particular project or series, but I don't know if that's the case. So I would love to know what your process of selection is like.
Yeah, well, for the bedroom series, my process of selection was basically whoever would volunteer to let me into their room, because that's a big ask to
Yeah.
have someone come into your space like that. And a lot of the initial drawings were drawings of good friends, some of whom I asked, and then some of whom volunteered after they saw what my project was. Um, but that was a different experience than the Baltimore work because with these rooms, I essentially scheduled a time to be in there, and then I had to, whatever time of day, whatever lighting was there, whatever time frame I had, like I had to get whatever image it was that was the best representation of that space. But with the Baltimore series, uh, these are all public buildings. Like you can see them whenever you want to, any time of day, any time of the year. And so, as I was searching out buildings for this project, I often would, think about what the structure was comprised of, and then like what time of day maybe I wanted to do it, and then what's around it. There's a lot of buildings in Baltimore that I love, but there's just too much around it to really capture that building. Um, so all of the pieces that I've chosen, there's not really a huge significance behind them. They're just buildings that I come across all the time. They're in, the part of Baltimore that I navigate on a regular basis.
Mhm.
But there's also definitely some, some interest to it. Like it's got to look interesting for me to draw it. Like it's got to be something I can draw. So it has to have like a good shape to it. It has to have good shadows if I'm going to draw it, since I essentially draw shadows. That's how I build up my drawings. But with the buildings, I had so much more leeway because if I, wanted to draw this building during the day, I could come back at any time and draw it. And because I had that kind of access, I tried to be very particular about what time of day I would choose to take the photograph. Because even though it's in black and white, you still really understand, like, if something is taken at like early morning, early evening, noon, and all of these times of day definitely evoke some kind of emotion in people. Like everyone has feelings about all of it.
Hey, sorry about that, folks. Okay, so I have another question about around what you like to work on and what you don't like to work on. And is there a particular type of object that you don't like to draw, or a particular style of building that you don't like to draw, or that makes you nervous and you tend to avoid?
I definitely, as I was drawing certain buildings of Baltimore, there's a lot of windows, and I definitely was conscious of how many windows was in a building as I was choosing it to draw. Um, and windows are probably the biggest challenge for me because they have to feel like they're sitting in the building, so they have to be at the right angle. You want them to feel, whether they have like a curtain behind them or, like the shine on them or the reflection on them. There's a lot to consider when it comes to a window. And I know at one point when I was working on the series, I think my cousin had suggested that I draw the Druid Hill Park, the botanical building,
Mm-hmm.
the Rawlings Blake, what is that building called?
Conservatory?
Yes, and it's just a big old glass building, and it's nothing but windows. And when she suggested it, I was like, I feel like you're trying to give me a heart attack. I don't want to draw that because that would be just like a little bit too tedious. So yeah, so there's definitely some architectural elements that um, are a little bit more tedious than others. And if I feel really, really drawn to something, I'll just suck it up and I'll just draw it and I'll just maybe complain a little bit about how many windows there are. But sometimes I definitely will not draw something because I'm not interested enough to do the labor that it would require.
Absolutely. We have a really good example of something that you're working on currently that you're sort of going to debut for us here. I'll just play it for folks. And you were talking specifically when we were preparing for this about doing this double process and how Windows played into this part of the process.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is a project I'm working on right now where I am drawing the same image twice. So it's a drawing from a photograph that was taken of the neighborhood that existed before Preston Gardens was built. It was a prominent Black business community that was torn down to build Preston Gardens, and I'm doing a project to bring awareness to what was in that space prior to the park. And so I'm drawing them simultaneously. The reason I'm drawing them twice is because they're going to be back to back, and I'm going to like have them so that you actually can never see them side by side. And at the bottom of each of them is going to be a quote from two Baltimore newspapers. One is going to be from the Afro, and one is going to be from the Baltimore Sun. And so it's the same exact image, but the two quotes will give you two very different perspectives on this neighborhood. So the point of doing them, similarly, so that you can see that you can see the same perspective or this, the same image, but have two different perspectives of something. And the way that I've decided to tackle this is to draw it at the same time. And for me, this makes sense because I don't draw things in like a mechanical way. I definitely like, there's not a lot of like, there's like, I have a process, but there's a lot of organic things that can happen during that process. Like I'm just making decisions left and right about how to, redraw something in black and white with charcoal. And so if I do it at the same time, then in theory, I will draw it exactly the same way because I just did it on the left and then I go and do it on the right. And so right now, this image is hard to see really what it's going to look like from this video, but it's essentially a whole city, like a whole block of houses. And so there are a lot of windows in all of these houses, and they're at different planed perspectives, and it's really old architecture, so everything is just a little wonky anyway. And so it's like, making it representing that wonkiness, but also making it look like things are sitting in there, is always like a challenge. But so right now I'm drawing one window on the left and then going over to the right and drawing the window again and then going back and forth. And so far it is not tedious and it is not annoying. It's actually really enjoyable because I'm just like thinking a lot about the pace in which I'm building up the images. And it's just been really great. I think a lot of people are like, "You're really crazy to do this." And I'm just like, "No, it's like the best thing. I love it."
I love that you kind of approach it with ferocity. So you really aren't really ever nervous about any particular item of a building or element of a building. It's really about how to tackle it. It seems like you go into kind of how can I just approach it as opposed to, oh, I'm just not gonna do it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I had a really great conversation with my husband like maybe a few years ago at this point. And I was just talking about, like we passed by like a tree stump and it was like the most beautiful like grain on the tree stump. And I was just like, that would be such a beautiful thing to draw. And I think he said something to the effect of like, that looks like that would be really hard. And I was just like, I can draw anything.
I
and,
love that.
and he was like, whoa, no modesty there. And I was like, no, like legit, like I can draw anything. Like it's gonna look like however I would draw it. And so like I set the standard of like what it looks like and how I draw it. And so I definitely, take everything that I draw as just like, I can draw this. There's no way I can't draw this. It's just sometimes things take a little bit longer to get to look a little bit better. But I definitely have a level of confidence about, my medium and my skill with how I draw things.
That's amazing. I wanted to go back to our stairs for just a moment and ask the question of if you have any tips for working with static objects or buildings, and maybe if we could focus on these particular set of stairs, because I think for some people stairs are some of the most challenging things to articulate to paper or painting, or even in some cases to photograph. To really get a full glimpse of and some people would say, oh, it's just stairs, right? So I'm curious if you have any tips for folks out there around how to draw or articulate staircases.
Well, since I draw specifically from photographs, like I would not sit in this stairwell and draw it. I would take a photograph of it and then come back to my studio and draw it from there. My first challenge is always how to get a good photograph of what I'm seeing. How can I get everything in the picture that I really love? And I'm not a trained photographer. Like I took one photography class at Micah, and that was it. So, and I just use my Pixel phone. I don't even have like a fancy camera because I just can't handle all those options. So, my first challenge would be how can I capture this well? And how can I get all the information that I want in the image? And then from there, I would come home and oftentimes, like, I play around with the image that I took, like, I'll crop it a little bit, or I do draw from the photograph. I like turn it to black and white, so I'm not drawing it in color. And sometimes after I've turned it to black and white, like I'll, amp up the contrast a little bit or dodge and burn some areas to make it look a little bit more dramatic. But I think like whenever you want to tackle anything that you want to draw, you just want to think about like what you want that drawing to look like. And if you in these situations, like you have lighting that is really specific, and so you just have to pick whatever angle you like with that particular lighting. And in this case, like there's two very different types of views that you can take. You can get one of like the stairs going up, or you can get like one of the ceiling and kind of like a little bit of the stair on the side. And so it's really all about like what you want the viewer to see. What is the thing you want them to feel as they look at it? Um, and then like with architecture, with buildings, I talked about like time of day and like how you want, like what kind of lighting you want, considerations of like shadows and contrast and all of that, especially with the way that I draw, is a huge part of it. Huge part, like tonal values, huge part. Yeah.
That's great. I feel like that for some folks it helps to kind of articulate, like if I'm drawing something static, because I think a lot of I would say a lot of artists working in the contemporary space aren't using illustration anymore, drawing as a medium, for a multitude of reasons. And I think one of them is because how do you capture it? How do you capture something and make it like an affirming image, object, subject to work in?
Yeah, and it's all about goals. It's all about what you want in your work. Like my goal is generally I want someone to feel like they can enter into that space. So I have to do whatever necessary to make a viewer feel like they can, visually enter into that space and really feel what it's like to be in that, that room around that building.
Right.
But there's so many different ways, to represent things. Like I probably do it in what many people would consider a pretty tight and meticulous manner, but you can draw in a much looser fashion and still represent something and still do a good job of, making people feel something about that staircase or about that space. And it's really just all about intention, like what you are interested in as the outcome of your work.
And this is just where I plug our space when we finally reopen. We really encourage you to come in and just start capturing the space in a whole new way, and hopefully are inspired by the way that Erin works and the medium and how it can evoke emotion through static objects and subjects. I have one last question, but I just want to make sure that folks know that they can ask any questions, and we'll end here. What are you looking forward to as we move through our timeline of existence?
I know one thing I really miss are hugs. Like
Yeah.
I really miss hugging people when I see them. But I'm really looking forward to experiencing art with other people in a space. I think we're very fortunate to get, to continue to experience the work of art and talk with artists right now virtually. But seeing things in person
Absolutely.
is still quite necessary. Like I know seeing my drawings in person makes a big difference than seeing them on a screen. Being in a space where a performance is happening, like that is really important to like feel the vibrations of the music and to like really and feel the air that like dancers can like have swinging around the room. Like these things are really important, and I look forward to being able to be enjoying them again.
That's a perfect way to end. I just want to thank Erin Fostel for being here. I want to thank our digital team for being awesome and putting this together and just making it flow so smoothly and nicely. I want to thank you, the audience, for being here and coming back to us for our program here, our evening program and our daytime program here at the Walters Digital Space. I've been Joy. That is Erin, and we'll see you in the next program. Goodbye for now.